Good evening. Tonight's story is The Charming Tale of Eleanor's Christmas by Robert Howard Russel. It appears in his book The Delft Cat and Other Stories, published in 1896. This is a more traditional Christmas story, without as much weirdness as we've explored so far this year. If you prefer the strange and the weird, I do have a whole playlist just for you, which I will link in the description below. This story is better suited for listening with a cup of cocoa and warm feet. I hope you enjoy it. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. The day was raw and cold. The street fakirs paused occasionally in their cries to promote their circulation by slapping their arms vigorously about their chests, or to blow little clouds of warm breath through their chilled fingers. Their trays, baskets, and pushcarts were laden with queer collections of toys, bric-a-brac, and catchpenny devices from all parts of the world. One cart was filled with an assortment of gaily painted tin cats, each pursuing a tiny mouse which was just beyond the reach of its nose. The peddler would place them on the sidewalk, and then off they would go in a mad dash over the stones, only stopping when run down, when, by winding up a spring concealed in the anatomy of the tin cat, the mouse was made to jump again, and the cat to resume the hopeless task of overtaking it. Further on were little equilibrists who never lost their balance on top of rolling barrels, no matter how hard they were pushed. Another peddler was selling remarkably small coins with the Lord's Prayer engraved on them, suspended from golden swords by a bright bit of red ribbon, and looking for all the world like a distinguished foreign decoration which could be had for the inconsiderable sum of 5 cents. The neighboring fakir, who may very possibly have been in partnership with the coin vendor, was offering powerful microscopes with which to decipher the inscriptions on the coins for a like sum of money. Nearby was a basketful of tall, dignified-looking Japanese storks with wire legs and long bills. They had beautiful white wings and red spots on their foreheads, while their backs were sprinkled with silver and gold, and their tails were trimmed in correct imitation of fashionably cut swallowtail coats. Another vendor, further down the street, was shouting in a hoarse voice, "Here you are! Papa and Mommer, 2 for a nickel, only 5 cents for the 2 of 'em." At his feet lay a large clothes basket filled with tiny little Japanese people, not more than 4 inches high, who looked very cold and uncomfortable with their gay paper gowns and bare feet, and the little man which the peddler held between his thumb and forefinger gave a plaintive squeak whenever he was pressed in the middle, which seemed to be his only sensitive spot. I had already purchased a tin cat and a stork, but still had a capacious empty pocket in my overcoat, and the pretty little Japanese lady looked at me so entreatingly, although she could not squeak like her husband, that I thought it would be an act of charity to find a home for these 2 friendless little foreigners, and in a minute more they were snugly stowed away in the warm lining of my deep pocket. I knew a poor little rich girl who had never owned a single inexpensive toy that she could play and do as she liked with. Her parents were so very rich that they only knew rich people, and, as they always went to the most expensive shops, they never even saw any nice cheap toys, and all the people that sent presents to the poor little rich girl did not dare send any but the most expensive ones, because they knew that if they sent any other kind, her parents might not approve of it. So, of course, the poor little rich girl could not play with her toys, as the happy little poor children do, for fear that she would break them or muss the beautiful Parisian gowns of her handsome dolls. Whenever the poor little rich girl wanted to play, she had a nurse who did almost all of her playing for her. This nurse would get the handsome dolls out of their elegant doll-houses and set them in a row. Then she would wind up the automatic toys and the musical boxes while the poor little rich girl looked on and tried to imagine that she was having a good time. But if she even lifted her hand to touch the dolls or the toys, her nurse would say, "Do be careful, Miss Eleanor. Mrs. Wealthy Smith sent you that, and I don't know what your mamma would say if you should break it." And the poor little rich girl would sometimes think that she would like to break something just to see what her mamma would say, for she very seldom had the opportunity of hearing her mamma say anything, For what with the operas and theatre parties and dinners and balls, her mamma had very little time to devote to her, and sometimes she would hardly see her for days at a time. So, of course, the poor little rich girl was rather afraid of her mamma's displeasure, as she didn't know her very well, not nearly so well as she knew her nurse, because she had to spend most of her life in company with her nurse, and had not the opportunity of being much with her mamma, although they lived in the same house. Sometimes the poor little rich girl would stand in the window of the elegant drawing-room and look out enviously at the happy little poor children who were playing in the streets and throwing snowballs at each other, for she had never even made a snowball in her life, although she longed to do so. But of course, when she went out on the street, she had to be dressed up in very fine clothes and had to wear little kid gloves, and her nurse would not let her touch the snow because it would have ruined her gloves, not to speak of her beautiful clothes. I was sorry for the poor little rich girl, and so I sent her the tin cat, the stork, and the 2 little Japanese dolls, all done up carefully in a box. When her nurse opened the box and saw what inexpensive toys they were, she turned up her nose at them and let the poor little rich girl have them to play with as much as she pleased, hoping they would soon be destroyed, as she considered such inexpensive toys a disgrace to the nursery. But the poor little rich girl was delighted with them, for she had never had any toys before that she could do as she pleased with, and after she had played with them all day, she placed them on a table at the side of her bed, so she could see them the moment she awoke in the morning. When she had said good night to them and had fallen asleep, the nurse went downstairs to talk to the new butler and left her all alone, and then the strangest thing happened. She was awakened by hearing the little man squeak several times, and, looking over at the table, she saw that the tin cat, whose spring had not quite run down, was poking the tin mouse at the lower ribs of the little Japanese man, and, although he did not seem to be afraid of the mouse, or of the cat either for that matter, he was so constituted that he simply had to squeak when anything touched him there, so he was simply obeying a law of his nature. The poor little rich girl was surprised at this performance, and, sitting up in bed, she said, "Seems to me you're making a great deal of noise." "I beg 1,000 pardons, madame," said the little Japanese man, bowing to the ground. "Allow me to introduce myself in order that I may offer you a suitable apology. My name is Kotobiki, which in Japanese means long life. This is Mine, my wife, and I can assure you that neither of us would have willingly disturbed you for the world. It was all the fault of Sherry Nico, the tin cat over there." "Well," said the tin cat, "I like that. Didn't you get right in front of me when I wanted to run down? Somebody left me half wound up, and I can never sleep when I'm wound up. I was just letting myself run down when you got in the way. I'm never so happy as when I'm run down. That's why I can't understand why people who are run down go to the doctors. Why, every day I see advertisements in their paper saying, 'Do you feel run down? If so, take good sarsaparilla for that tired feeling.' If people only knew they could be happier if they were run down instead of wound up, they wouldn't buy patent medicines or pay doctor bills." "Ka-choo! Ka-choo! Perhaps you could tell me what to do for a cold in the head," sneezed Kotobiki. "I knew I should catch one. In fact, I told Mine so when we were lying in the basket on that cold sidewalk yesterday. If you would examine me, you would see that there are only 2 things that I can catch very well, chilblains and colds in the head. You see, I haven't any body, but my clothes are just stuffed with paper from my head to my feet, so, of course, having only my head and my feet to get ill with, the variety of diseases to which I am liable is limited. But when I do get a cold in the head, I have a frightful time. Quinine pills do me no good, for if I take them, they only fall through the bottom of my neck and drop on the top of my feet, where they rattle about and annoy me." "Well," said the tin cat, "you're better off than I am. It's much better not to have any body than it is to have wheels and cogs which squeak and rattle so you can't hear yourself think. Why, only last week my mainspring was paralyzed so that I couldn't move. I had to be strapped down on my back in a machine shop and have it removed and a new one inserted. How's that for torture? I never suffered so since the day I was soldered." "I suppose we all have our troubles to bear," said Mine. "And that reminds me that Nagai, the stork over there, seems to have something on his mind which is troubling him very much. I called him Nagai Hashi, which means long legs, yesterday, and I think that annoyed him, but I am afraid he has a more serious trouble today. He looks so sad and depressed." "I'll ask him what's the matter," said the Tin Cat, and with a little whir of his wheels he crossed the table where Nagai was standing and questioned him. Nagai shook his head dolefully as he answered, "I've been thinking." "Ah ha ha!" laughed the Tin Cat. "This really is too good. You've been thinking, have you? Well, take my advice and never do it again, for if your head should get heavy from thought, you'd topple over and break your neck. You're too tall to risk thinking." "When you have finished with your irrelevant and discourteous interruption," said the Stork coolly, "I will continue." "Oh, that's all right, old chap," said the Tin Cat. "I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, but the idea was rather ridiculous. Come now, wasn't it?" "To a thoughtless and frivolous person like yourself, it may have appeared so," returned Nagai sternly. "But, to resume my statement, I was thinking that the man who would not buy me because I was not for anything was right. You see, just before I was bought and brought here with the rest of you, a man came along and was going to buy me. He held out the money for me to the peddler, who was wrapping me up and was about to take me, when he suddenly withdrew his hand and asked the peddler what I was for. "Nothing," said the peddler. "Well, if he isn't for anything, I don't see how I can use him," said the man, and passed on. Since then, I have been terribly depressed, for I think it was true, and I am not for anything. If I were, I think I should know it. I have tried to stick pins in my breast to see if I were a pincushion, but I'm not. And this afternoon it occurred to me that I might possibly be a paperweight, so I climbed up on the desk and stood on some papers for an hour, when somebody opened the library door and the draft blew me over and I fell into the wastepaper basket, although the door did not make enough wind to disturb the papers. It has since occurred to me that my bill, which is made of 2 pieces of bamboo, might have been intended for toothpicks, but if that is so, what was the use of making the rest of me?" "Dear me," said the Tin Cat. "Some people are never satisfied. If you only knew it, you're much better off than I am. Look at me. Nobody can say that I'm not for something, for my vocation is plain. It is to run after that mouse. Nobody ever sees me doesn't wind me up and start me off again, and I never stop until I run down or bump into the leg of a chair. They all know just as well as you and I do that it's a physical impossibility for me to catch the mouse, for he's held in place by a strong wire that always keeps him an inch ahead of my nose. But they never tire of starting me afresh on the useless, hopeless chase, and sometimes I get so awfully sick of it all I wish somebody would step on me and break my wheels so I could never run down again. You don't have anything like that to worry you. All you have to do is stand still and do nothing." "Say," interrupted Kotabiki, "it is nearly 12 o'clock, and it will be Christmas in a minute. Mine, you watch the long hand on the clock, and when it points to 12 o'clock, we'll all say Merry Christmas together to Miss Eleanor, and thank her for the beautiful home we have now, for it is certainly much more comfortable for us to be here than on that cold sidewalk." Just then the hands of the clock reached 12, and the Stork opened his bill wide, and they all shouted Merry Christmas together. And then the poor little rich girl tried to say, "The same to you and many of them." But the words wouldn't come, no matter how hard she tried, and she could feel her head nodding and her eyelids closing up tight, and then she didn't know anything of what went on until the next morning, when her nurse waked her and showed her lots of new, expensive toys that had been brought to her by Santa Claus that brings presents to little rich girls. But she turned her back on all of them, and kissed the little Japanese woman and the little Japanese man, and petted the Stork, and held the Tin Cat in her arms, for she felt that she knew them better than the others. And besides, hadn't they all sat up until very late the night before, just to wish her a Merry Christmas? I really like this story. Although everyone has their complaints, it has a really gentle tone that is well suited for this season. I think it's interesting that the story begins with a narrator, an I character, but then it just abandons the first-person perspective without elaborating on it. And normally, I hate the ambiguous, "it was all a dream" ending, but in this case, I think it's a really nice touch. It allows for this element of fantasy, and it inspires Eleanor's devotion without having to explain a whole universe of talking toys. And I love how thoroughly the character of the toys are developed in their little monologues. They're wonderfully present and realized and complex, each of them trying to solve their own little problems, but they're all happy and grateful to Miss Eleanor. I know that in these days where we are highly aware of suffering and deprivation in the world, a poor little rich girl story may seem a little bit out of touch. For me, it works here because this is such an incredibly traditional story. It's the kind of classic Christmas story I remember from childhood, when, perhaps, we didn't have quite as much social awareness as we do now. I strongly prefer it to something depressing like The Little Match Girl, although the repeated references to the happy poor children are a bit much. And Eleanor really does seem to have a kind of bleak life. The bit where she has to watch her nurse play with her toys and try to imagine that she's having a good time is wonderfully written. I think this way of highlighting her loneliness makes her sympathetic and engaging without going kind of too overboard on the pity party. In short, this story leaves me liking all the characters and very happy with the outcome, and it's very well suited for the holidays. It's a kinder counterpart to A Tragedy, the story of a couple weeks ago, where the secret life of knickknacks is much, much darker. Robert Howard Russel does not have a Wikipedia page. He wrote just a couple of books. He also appears to have been part of R.H. Russell and Son publishers, although I'm not clear whether he was the father or the son. They only published a few books. They're very beautiful. They pop up in museums and specialty auctions and things like that. Illustrator F. Berkeley Smith was an American artist and a writer who mostly lived and worked in France. He also doesn't have a Wikipedia page, and I can't find public domain images of his illustrations to show here, but they're also really beautiful. I recommend looking at them. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, I make a little confession out here, and this week's confession is that I have been having enormous connectivity issues at home. Internet service is ostensibly supplied by my building and included in the rent, but experience has also proven that getting tech support from my property management company is a disaster. And it is, of course, absolutely maddening because I work online and I need to get things done, but also because 1,000 times a day I think of little things I want to do or look up or know about or follow up on, and the inability to easily do those things is just a constant source of frustration. Most of the aspects of creating these videos, like making the recording and doing the sound and the video edits, those things can be done offline, but performing all the research and finding all the image assets, and then doing, of course, the final uploading requires internet access. And I've been kind of half and halving it from coffee shops and friends' houses and whatnot. Do I have a solution? Of course I have a solution. I am moving, although don't tell anybody because I haven't given notice yet. So, in addition to all the other things I hope to accomplish with the move, I am literally daydreaming about routers and signal extenders and being able to get service directly from the provider so I can call them in the event of problems and outages. Someday. You are listening to Restored Lore, where every week I find an odd, interesting, or obscure story and I share it with you. If you've listened this far, please don't forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. I hope you're enjoying your holiday season. I will see you next week.